the better self. There's a story told about my great-grandmother, my mother's mother's mother, great-grandmother Linda. She lived in the tiny town of Sosnowiec, in that part of Poland, which had once belonged to Germany, hence the name Lerner, and in her day belonged to the Tsar of all the Russias. She was healthy, wealthy, and extremely fertile. She survived 2 husbands and 16 children. Or rather, she produced 16 children, although some of them did live somehow to feel that she was surviving them and would survive them way beyond. Her wealth derived from 2 sources. She was the silent partner in a lumber business, which was publicly owned by a prince, because the Tsar of all the Russias did not allow Jews to own certain kinds of businesses in those days. And she owned a large and prosperous tavern. But it was said that what really made her rich was not the kind of businesses she had, but the kind of businesswoman she was. And this is one of the stories told to illustrate that. Like all the women of her class, she sent all her babies off to be wet nursed. But she did something special. She paid a little under the going rate and supplemented it with a generous portion of food. She figured, I buy in bulk, almost at wholesale prices. I can afford to look generous with the food and cut back on the cash. And then somewhere around the time of the birth of her 10th child, she had her really brilliant idea. She decided that she would make the wet nurses eat all the food in front of her. So all the nourishment would go into their breast milk for her babies, and none of it would be wasted by being taken home to their own starving children. Great businesswoman, my great-grandmother. I have often imagined the scene. I picture it on an emerald lawn in front of a large stone house. My grandmother standing, the wet nurse sitting at a little wooden table, the weight of her breast pulling her shoulders forward, and my grandmother in an elegantly beribboned basket on the ground. My great-grandmother watches as the servant brings out the food, a plate of steaming kasha varnikas, roasted buckwheat groats with a little bow tie-shaped pastas slathered in chicken fat, and a piece of chicken. She watches to make sure that every morsel goes into the wet nurse, and none of it is discreetly tied in a handkerchief or rolled up in the hem of a skirt or split into a pot. She watches. But as she watches, she begins to feel something pulling her from behind, pulling her back towards the house, back to the very back of the house where the kitchen is. And as she feels the tug, she sees an image. She sees herself walking into the kitchen where there is a counter piled high with freshly baked rolls, and where the open door of a larder reveals a huge wheel of ripened cheese. She sees herself going to a cabinet, taking out a snowy white napkin, piling rolls in it, taking a knife from the drawer, cutting a wedge of cheese, putting it in the napkin, tying it all up, rushing outside, and giving it to the wet nurse, saying, "Here, for the kinder." Well, of course, she resists. She resists this impulse to do the thing that would undermine every principle by which she has ever lived, the thing that could destroy her life. Instead, she watches until every morsel of food has disappeared, turns on her heel, goes to the house, and tells the servant to go and clear away the dishes. Well, we all know that feeling, don't we? The pull of the better self, calling us to do that one good thing that if we did it, if we followed it to its logical conclusion, would completely undo us. A number of years ago, I was still living in New York. I decided one beautiful Memorial Day weekend that I would go visit friends who had a large and lovely house on many acres in southern New Jersey. And so I found myself in the Port Authority bus terminal, shuffling across the dirty asphalt-tiled floor under the flickering of fluorescent lights and feeling the pressure of travel. The pressure of all those people buying tickets for places where they hoped something wonderful would happen to them. And of all those people buying tickets for places where they never wanted to arrive. And just as I was thinking that I would never make it to the ticket window in time to catch my bus, I realized that I was almost there. In front of me was just one couple. A middle-aged African-American couple, carefully but certainly not expensively dressed. And then I heard the ticket seller's voice say, "Well, that's not enough money for these tickets." I saw the man's shoulders slump under the cheap gray fabric of his suit. I saw his wife's eyes go wide with fear under the brim of her yellow straw hat, and then go in with pain, and then narrow into murderous slits. And I could see a family's whole holiday weekend going up in smoke. I had just finished reading Let Us Now Praise Famous Men by James A.G. Walker Evans, that extraordinary book, not so much about rural Southern poverty as about the rural Southern poor. That book in which you can hear the cracked voices of people who feel that everybody has forgotten them. In which you can almost feel the grain in the sun-bleached wood on their shacks and in their sunburned and weather-beaten faces. In which you can fall into the eyes of a child that still sparkle with hope, or be pushed off the page by the blank gaze of another child who has given up on everything, both clutching the faded gingham skirt of their mother. And I think it was because I had just finished reading this book that I found myself stepping forward and saying, "Here, let me buy your tickets." They fell to either side of me like the Red Sea and said, "Oh no, we couldn't, I insist," I said. I stepped forward, gave the man the money, repeated their destination, got their tickets, gave him money, got my ticket, gave them their tickets, scribbled my name and address on a piece of paper and said, "Here, pay me back when you can," and disappeared into the crowd. Well, of course, within the week, a check arrived in the mail. But not just a check. With the check, there was an invitation to dinner. And I felt really caught. There was a part of me that wanted to go, that felt I should go to allow St. John's to do the thing that would allow them to feel all right with what had passed between us. And there was another part of me that wanted to go, the part that lives in all of us unparented people, the part that longs for a family and fantasizes that we might find it anywhere. And then there was the part that did not want to go, the part that dreads above all being bored by strangers. Well, the first two parts went out, and so I found myself taking 2 rattling subway trains to Brooklyn, a borough I never visited, and emerging into the smoky evening air in a neighborhood of shabby 2-family homes with streets lined with 5 to 10-year-old cars. I walked the 2.5 blocks to the address I'd been given and rang the doorbell. The door opened and I entered a space whose details to this day I cannot remember, except that it felt claustrophobic. Ceilings too low and lights much too bright. We sat perched on the living room furniture, on which I thought I could still smell the plastic from the slipcover that had just been removed. And after a couple of minutes of silence, I said, "How was your week?" "Fine," they said, both speaking and nodding in unison. I hoped they would not ask me about mine. I did not want to have to talk about the house with the large and airy rooms, the fine wines, the exquisite food, the beautiful man-made pond for swimming. And blessedly they didn't. Instead, Mrs. St. John popped up like toast out of a toaster and said, "Dinner's ready." And I followed them into a tiny dining room where the chairs almost touched the walls. 2 teenagers appeared, a boy and a girl lived out of nowhere. There were cursory introductions. And we sat down to a table piled high with food that I would never normally eat. Fried chicken with creamed gravy, creamed corn, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, candied yams with pineapple, collards cooked with ham hocks, Parker House rolls, and a huge salad of iceberg lettuce and palette tomatoes doused with what I knew had to be Kraft's so-called French dressing. The French have never seen that color orange. But I was determined that good manners would win out over health concerns. And so I smiled and reached for the plate of chicken until I noticed that everybody else had their hands folded in front of them. I realized my mistake, pulled my hand back, got an approving smile from Mrs. St. John, who proceeded to say a brief grace, ending by thanking God for my presence at their table. And then there settled upon us that blessed silence that often comes to people when confronted with large platters of food. I ate as little as I possibly could without being absolutely rude. And when at the end of the meal a huge gooey white layer cake was brought out, I professed that I could not possibly eat another bite. Which in fact was true, because the little I had eaten was sitting like a nut in my stomach. I waited till they finished their desserts, looked at my watch, feigned surprised at the time, and said I had to be going. And within a minute or so I found myself out in the street again, feeling relief. At last. And of course, feeling disappointment. I was alone. The connection I had fantasized about never happened. Of course, I realize now that all I would have had to do was remark upon how uncomfortable we all felt. But my better self had not made it out to Brooklyn. That was not the end of the St. John's, of course. For years I got Christmas cards, until I finally moved and the postman stopped forwarding my mail. But to get back to my great-grandmother. What of the wet nurse in the scene? What of her? Well, she sits there, in front of the plate of steaming food. She has been fantasizing about this meal since the night before. And yet somehow she cannot reach for it until she gets an imperious moo from my great-grandmother and finds herself stuffing the food into her mouth, not tasting the bite. She looks down at my grandmother. She looks up at my great-grandmother. And she does not know who she hates more, the child or the mother. When she finishes, she wipes her mouth on her sleeve, and when the servant has cleared away the dishes, she lifts the basket and puts it on the table, lifts her shirt, scoops my grandmother up, and puts her to her breast. She feels no pleasure as the little lips close over her nipple. After a couple of minutes, she looks around. She sees that she is absolutely alone. She yanks the child off the breast, shoves her back in the basket, pulls the blanket up over her head, puts the basket on the floor, and walks off. And what of my grandmother? She lies there, not making a sound. She learned long ago it's no good to cry when you're hungry. You will be fed when the adults decide it is time to feed you. And when finally she is lifted up and put to the breast of the woman who smells nothing like the woman who bore her, the smell she's been missing for months, she wraps her lips around the leathery nipple, which tastes salty and bitter, and then blessedly feels the sweet milk come into her and starts to relax. And then she feels heat across her face and opens her eyes to see the wet nurse glaring at her with a look that turns the milk to vinegar in her stomach. But some instinct of self-preservation keeps her sucking until suddenly she is yanked off, slammed down, and sees the sky disappear. Well, of course, my grandmother grows up, the youngest of 16, to loathe large families. She attempts to abort her fourth child, my mother, and then raises her grudgingly, a pattern my mother repeats with me. But before doing this, she comes to America with her new handsome husband, the idealistic socialist who tells her, no, she's not going to start a business. He will have no capitalists in his family. He goes to work in a sweatshop, becomes a union organizer, and consigns them to utter poverty. My grandmother writes back to her brothers and sisters in Poland. She doesn't exactly reveal her state. She simply says, don't come to America. It's not a good place for rich people. They heed her advice. They stay in Poland. And they're all killed in the Holocaust. I myself have no children. It was as if I always knew that that better self that had barely made it out of Sosnovich alive would not survive any encounter I had with maternity. But sometimes when I'm shopping and I see a child in a stroller or in a shopping cart, looking around, trying to get his mother's attention, while the mother is busy scanning the shelves, I go and I talk to the child. And I say something like, wow, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad your mother brought you. You must be a great comfort and a great help to her. And sometimes the mother hears me, and she turns around, and she smiles at the child. And something in both of them relaxes, as if they have just remembered something wonderful about each other. And sometimes the mother doesn't hear me, or pretends not to, and suddenly turns and wheels the child away, and the child starts to cry. And my better self, which has just briefly emerged, goes back and is buried again under, will I get mine? Will I get enough? Will somebody else get more? And wonders if she will ever have the courage to speak again.